Welcome to Clause 8, the voice of IP, hosted by Eli Mazur. Louis Carbonneau is one of the world's top patent brokers who has brokered over 4,500 patents. He was once the head of licensing at Microsoft before starting his own patent brokerage firm, Tangible IP. At that time, it was the Wild West of patent brokering. There were days of billion-dollar patent deals. Many were eager to join in on this action. But after the gold rush died down and many got out, Louis stuck with it. On this episode, Eli and Louis talk about that history, how patent transactions get done, what makes patents valuable today, and how Apple survived because of a patent deal. Clause 8 is part of IP Watchdog and sponsored by Harity, the go-to firm for the Patent 300 for patent preparation and prosecution.
Thank you so much for joining.
My pleasure.
The first question that I like to start with is, do you remember when you first learned about patents, and did you have any thoughts about the role they played?
When I first learned about patents, that was back in law school. Yeah, I mean, this was obviously something when you take your first IP class, you don't know what you're doing. It's usually an elective class, and you're just trying to fill in your credits for the semester. So I was going into this completely oblivious to the fact that, patents, copyrights, trademarks were all, different rights, IP rights that you could have. And so, I grew up in Montreal, Quebec. So, it's a very different environment as far as IP is concerned than what you have in the US. I always tell people in Canada, IP is a recreational sport, and in the US, it's a full contact sport, to keep the hockey analogy. So it was quite a discovery. And so I kind of stumbled into this and really liked the class. And the teacher, the IP teacher, was a practicing lawyer at a local law firm, actually asked me later on to come and help them update I think they were editing a trademark, treaties every year. So they had to basically photocopy thousands of pages to update, the cases and all this. So they gave me a part-time job because I asked too many questions in class, and that's how I kind of, work. My first job was actually with an IP firm, when I was probably 19 or 20 years old.
And eventually you joined Microsoft in 1998. Was that in Canada or in the US?
Well, actually, a little bit of both. I joined Microsoft, so I was in private practice as a patent litigator in Canada up to 95, and then Microsoft had just made its first large, foreign acquisition when they bought a company called Softimage in 1995, which was a computer graphics company that came to fame by animating the first dinosaurs in the initial Jurassic Park movie. And Nathan Myhrvold, who was the then CTO of Microsoft and a big fan of dinosaur bones, because he was doing a lot of searches himself, going to the Badlands area, and he was into dinosaurs. When he saw the dinosaurs animated by Softimage authoring tools, he just went nuts, and he said, we need to buy this company, which frankly was probably not the best business case, but lo and behold, they bought Softimage in 95, and then after the dust settled, they were looking for an IP lawyer to become the GC of the subsidiary, and that's how I started with Microsoft. So I actually started as a part of the legal department, which was obviously directed from Redmond. I was the only headcount in the whole company in Montreal that actually reported to someone in Seattle, in Redmond, near Seattle, at the headquarters. But I was, based in Montreal for 3 years, and then, by the time I had kind of gone around the garden, they offered me a promotion with a one-way ticket in '98 to go to Seattle to continue to work with them at the headquarters.
And obviously we'll talk about Nathan Myhrvold. He's a founder, I guess some people might say the infamous founder of Intellectual Ventures. So that's an interesting connection. Mm-hmm. I guess he's responsible for bringing you to America in some ways. I guess, can you give us a sense of what Microsoft was at the time? Obviously 1998 was, when DOJ filed its antitrust lawsuit. It was right before the dot-com bubble burst. I guess, what was it like being part of that company at that time?
Yeah, no, it's a great question because Microsoft was a very different company. Microsoft, if you go back to the late 90s, Microsoft was at the top of the world. If you work for Microsoft, people were just looking at you differently. It was really very cool to be with Microsoft. This was the kind of the most admired company in the world at that time. There was no Google. The Apple was just a ghost of itself at that time. Actually, people don't realize Microsoft kind of saved Apple from pretty much going bankrupt in 98, I believe, when we in the disguise of a patent cross licensing deal, we essentially gave Apple, I think, $500 million in cash so they could last a little bit longer. And right after that, Steve Jobs came back, and the goal was really to keep at least one competitor, alive, so that the DOJ would not be on our back too early. Because otherwise, if Apple was going away, Microsoft was becoming not only the de facto monopoly, but the only operating system left. So we couldn't just hand money out like this. So we actually did a patent cross licensing deal with Apple, where we decided to pay them a pretty handsome fee for the licensing. You cross license obviously all your portfolio, but there's always someone writing a check to the other party. And at that time, although we had a decent amount of patents, we ended up writing a big check, which was in part predicated by the fact that we wanted Apple to stay around, and that was actually probably the first thing. No, I think Steve Jobs was just back then, and that was his first move, was to call Bill Gates and say, let's do a deal, so we can get some fresh cash to help the company. And then the rest is history. Apple then just kind of took off when Jobs was back. So, but it was a very different company, much smaller, obviously. I think the legal department, I think they were just about maybe 20 lawyers total, and they, when I left, I think they were over 200. So it grew very, very fast after that. And then, we went into DOJ mode in 2000, and then a lot of things changed. We lost some of our swagger, and we had to have a much more, I would say, accommodating stance with our partners. Whereas historically, it was very easy to do deals when you were at Microsoft. You just had to say no, and the other guys would cave in, right? That was not the fact after 2000. So, and then other companies started getting bigger, and there was a bit more of an even playing field. But it was a very tough period when we were in the midst of the DOJ, and everybody hated us, and it was hard to find friends around.
That's interesting about Apple, that you could, especially in light of their more recent history, is that they basically survived because they were able to monetize their patent portfolio. It seems that.
Yeah, in part. I mean, obviously, I don't think it's being documented like this, and people who were involved will probably, say that that's not the case. But that's kind of our understanding, internally, that part of that was really to help them stay around, and that was the first deal that Jobs did, when he came back to Apple. So yes, it's a little bit ironic given Apple's stance with patents nowadays, that this is what kind of kept them alive.
So I mean, your title eventually was Microsoft General Manager of IP Licensing. I guess my question is, I guess, were you, I guess, was your role licensing patents? And I guess, why was Microsoft even interested in doing that? Obviously, their core is selling software and services. Why were they even interested in, I guess, spending their time and energies into licensing their IP?
Yeah. Well, as you know, there's licensing and licensing. So, when we were telling our business colleagues that we were doing licensing, they said, well, that's what we do. We license Office, we license Windows, we have all these different licenses. I said, no, it's a different type of licensing. We're licensing not products, but, underlying IP and patents. So it was a very different thing. To be honest, the way it came about, it really started when Marshall Phelps came in from IBM, and Marshall is the one who had pretty much built the IP licensing business and patent licensing business at IBM, and made it, to be a powerhouse and cash cow. So he came to I think he was negotiating against Bill Gates in some deal, and Bill said you should come to Microsoft, and he lured him away from IBM, and Marshall came, and Marshall said, we need to change the way we do business here, and we're sitting on these thousands of patents and all this IP that is doing nothing, and we need to make friends. We need to have partners. We need to show we're a good player in the industry. So that kind of changed the narrative completely, very quickly. Actually, it took a few months, and Marshall had this kind of honeymoon period where he could do no wrong and pretty much do almost what he wanted. So he did a lot during these months, and part of that was to build an IP licensing business. And on my end, I had been, the attorney leading the team that was supporting all of our Microsoft research labs around the world. We had about 1,000 PhDs around the world in 6 or 7 labs, and I was responsible for the legal team that harvested all the IP from these labs, and obviously built a portfolio and then gave all the legal advice. So Marshall and I had told them that there was a lot of good stuff coming out from the labs outside, and some R&D groups as well in Japan and Ireland that was kind of left to stagnate because nobody was really paying attention. So he said, well, you found the problem, now you have to be part of the solution. So they created a new team, which was the international IP team, and eventually that led to me taking over, and then taking over all the licensing of our IP. And by IP, we meant at that time 2 things: the patent portfolio, and all the unproductized technologies that were coming from our research lab. Some of which were actually transferred into products, but sometimes it took years, even internally, to do the tech transfer from research to products. And a lot of these things were also amenable to different scenarios, different user cases. So for instance, everybody knows Microsoft's flight simulator product back then that was very popular when there were very few titles. Flight Simulator was probably the most sold title in terms of people having computer games before the first consoles and all that.
Well, I remember playing it with my dad.
Yeah, it was a great product, and it was a great engine underlying that. And actually, we took the simulation engine and we licensed it out in other scenarios, in other vertical markets that had nothing to do with flight simulation. And that's just one example of something that had been productized, but could lend itself to other licensing scenarios. So this is an example. We also had a bunch of really cool research code that and IP and patents that we could package together, and we did actually a few what we called IP ventures. We enabled a few companies, some of which are still around, like INRIX in Seattle, which is in traffic data, was created using a lot of Microsoft IP, and then was spun out with one of our employees back then. Another company, Zumobi, which really was the pioneer that built those little tiles that used to be on someone's phone. Now, obviously, everybody, all the phones, apps are based on tiles and the way all these tiles are architecture. But that was basically some technology from our Microsoft Research Lab in Redmond that became Zumobi, that built the apps for a lot of the large players back then. We're talking 15 years ago. So there were some IP ventures there, and then a bunch of just more discrete deals to enable partners to use some of the technology and patents from Microsoft. So we were tiptoeing into this. I mean, the other impetus is that every year we had a budget shortfall. I mean, by the time I was head of that team, we were filing about 3,300 patents a year on average. And to file all these patents and maintain all and prosecute all the other ones we had already, the budget by then, we're talking 15 years ago, was already north of $300 million a year. It was huge. So we had a shortfall of about $55 million, every year, and we had to make it up. And they said, well, this you have to find the money. So either you win the lottery or you license IP. So we thought the odds were a bit better licensing IP, although not that much better. But that's what we did. We had to make up for our own budget shortfall. So there was a lot of pressure, very artificial numbers, if you ask me. No bearing on in reality, but still we had to make that amount of money early on. So there was a real forcing function to make it work.
Yeah, so that's interesting. I mean, obviously, a lot of high tech companies these days have huge patent portfolios, but I guess they're resistant to monetizing those portfolios, and they don't kind of they don't think about it in that way in terms of we have to cover our own costs for growing our patent portfolio, right? It was a different.
Yeah, and it has to do a lot, Eli, with the way that IP um, is being treated internally, financially wise. And by this I mean, if the patents belong to corp or to the legal group, which rolls into corp, um, it's a very different story than if they belong to the business units. And same thing for licensing. So and everyone I've ever talked that did or does my job or the job I used to have knows that the hardest thing in life is to pry patents out of a business unit when you want to sell them and monetize them. Although they belong to the company, they're a corporate asset. These business units they couldn't care less about patents until you tell them that you'd like to sell them, and then they become extremely territorial because you know it's very human nature. They say, wait a minute, if we sell or license these patents to a third party and these guys end up building a killer app that makes us look bad, we don't want to be there. We don't want to be these guys. So they will fight tooth and nail for no other reasons than pretty much avoid embarrassment against selling or licensing patents. And I now see this with clients of ours. We represent Siemens, we represent Honeywell, we represent a lot of large companies, and my counterparts in those companies who are trying to monetize their portfolio are telling me it is so hard to get approval to sell or license anything because the business units don't want to let them go for no other reason that someone might succeed where they failed and they will look bad. So.
That's interesting. And so, did you use patent brokers when you were at Microsoft? Did you too?
Well, we were courted and solicited often by patent brokers to basically help us sell our patents. So we might have worked with one or two firms, and actually this is why I became a patent broker after that. Is because when I did leave Microsoft in 2009, Ivy Intellectual Venture was buying patents, left and right at that time, and some of those brokers contacted me because they were having a hard time getting their calls returned by the Ivy people, and they said, "Well, Louis, you know them, you're local. Can you help us?" And that's how I kind of tiptoed into patent brokerages. Essentially, I help them just essentially bridge the gap and get their calls returned. And I would meet with the guys at IV locally, at their offices. And that's how we got a few deals done. And eventually I decided that, wow, I can do all these things and I can actually make money doing this. So I'll do it myself. But what's very funny, though, is, going back to Nathan Merville and Intellectual Ventures, we were in the patent group when Nathan came and pitched the IV model to Microsoft, and they wanted Microsoft to be one of the early funders and early adopters of IV, and everybody in the patent group was very skeptical because we know what patent licensing and patent assertion is, and having an investment thesis that assumes that everybody, if you have enough patents in one area, everybody will flock to you and beg you to give them a license, we thought was just very naive, and that you would never have to sue anyone was extremely naive. But Nathan was just relentless, and he convinced Bill Gates to put his own money, personal money, and then Ben said, well, if I'm going to put some money, Microsoft has to follow on and put some money as well. So we were kind of, our arms were kind of twisted to get into IV in the first place, because if you ask anyone in the patent group, we knew this business a lot better. Nobody really thought that this was necessarily going to work. At least not the way Nathan thought it was going to work. And lo and behold, when finally people came to the realization that, okay, you show me 200 patents that you think that you say I need to license, just show me the one I'm infringing, and then we'll talk about it. And then
Yeah.
the whole house of cards collapsed pretty quickly, right? Because then they had to
Yeah.
sue, and then when they started suing, they became enemy public number one, and then the rest is history.
Yes. Yeah. So that's very interesting. I actually never heard about that, obviously, about the skepticism from the beginning, because in the beginning it seemed like there was a lot of hype about them, about they're unstoppable and all that, I guess. And then it turned out
Well,
that
from a founder standpoint, it was a fantastic business model because they managed to create a fund, which means that when you're a fund manager, you get a carry, which is usually 2% or more over the cost or on the total money that's being committed, right? So they made a fortune just with their carry, regardless of the performance of the funds. And I think it's public knowledge that these funds did not perform really well. Um, for a while it did. The initial investors were making money because it was a little bit of like a Ponzi scheme where as long as you find some new investor, you can repay your initial investors. So the Microsoft and the Intel and I think other large companies that invested quickly, I think made some money on some of the funds, but most of the later stage investors didn't make a penny or maybe broke even. But I think it's public with how well or how badly these funds did. It was an interesting business model.
You mentioned the patent brokers that were approaching you for help making the right contacts and all that. So I was just wondering, who were those people in terms of what was their background? I'm just curious about who were the patent brokers at the time when you joined the field? Were they former patent litigators or?
Yeah, that's interesting. We're going back to 2009, which was kind of I would say, high water of patent brokerage and patent transactions. This was, pretty much the years when IV was very active buying patents by the billions. They spent $4 or $5 billion in acquiring patents over the years. So obviously they were buying a lot of stuff, and including a lot of crap, just because they had to buy by a date certain and they had to make numbers. So there was an incentive to buy, regardless sometimes of the actual pedigree of the portfolios. So it was pretty easy to be a patent broker, which means that you would find almost any kind of, people coming from all walks of life being brokers at that time. And they were people who were, selling to IV and getting a commission on the buy side and on the sell side at the same time. It was just the Wild West at that time. That was, before I started, doing that. So those were the years of easy money, I would say. And that kind of culminated in 2012, with the Nortel deal and all this, when I think we reached the apex, and then it kind of just went down the drain in 2013, significantly, and never really recovered. But so at that time there were hundreds of brokers because it was so easy, and obviously it's an unregulated profession, so anyone could hang their shingle and say I'm a patent broker. And even today, by all measures, except today, nobody in their right mind wants to do that because it's so hard. But in those days, it was pretty easy. So you would find a lot of people. Yes, I mean, some patent litigators or former patent litigators, but some business people, some financial people, a lot of lawyers, a lot of people with technical background, sometimes a combination thereof. It was a pretty diversified field, but I would say the common thread was people who were actively involved in IP and IP licensing, usually, or IP litigation or IP transactions. So there was always that common thread. But you had some technical, legal, and financial people, I would say, as far as their professional background.
Yes, so we'll get into a little more about we'll get into tangible IP in a minute. I had one last question about Microsoft. I guess shortly after you left, you mentioned the huge Nortel deal, which is when they sold the their patents for $4.5 billion to a consortium involving Microsoft in 2011. But then in 2012, Microsoft acquired AOL's patents for over $1 billion. And you mentioned what an active program Microsoft had, filing and acquiring patents on their own. I guess, what did you think about that acquisition?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure if you ask people who did the deal today, they would probably say they overpaid. But you could say that almost every patent transaction, that was in the hundreds of millions or the billions of dollars, because patents were kind of overhyped at that time, and there was a pretty high premium. And people thought they were the next kind of commercial currency to have, because the legal environment was quite different than it is today. So, I mean, I don't have, specific thought about that transaction. I mean, it was a big number, but they were available because of AOL, obviously being sold, and so they must have thought at that time that this was filling a strategic gap. I would say most patent transactions that were in the hundreds of millions or billions ended up probably being a kind of a dog, because you can monetize so many patents in a portfolio, and the rule of thumb, as most people in the industry know, is that for every 100 patents you probably have 4 or 5 that are really good, and the rest just comes for the ride. So it's I'm pretty sure I'd be surprised. Let's put it this way: I'd be very surprised if they recoup their investment by monetization of the portfolio itself. They may have it may have had value as a defensive weapon to deter lawsuits, or maybe it helped get better payments, incoming payments through cross-patent licensing discussions, things like that. It's very hard to calculate the ROI over these large deals, because they get sliced and diced so many different ways that nobody can really track whether it was a good deal or a bad deal 10 years later.
And you mentioned you started I guess you started Tangible IP, which is your brokerage firm, in 2011. That's really when you saw the peak of maybe the patent prices, but also the patent troll narrative. I mean, when you started it, did you expect there to be a kind of a change in, I guess, the value of patents, and I guess the patent system getting weaker and it being more difficult, I guess, to license and enforce patents?
No, if I had, I don't think I would have started this company in the first place. My first full year, I really started Tangible IP at the end of 2011, after I decided to just do it by myself, as opposed to just helping other guys and then getting some crumbles of what they were making. So the business model just didn't work, and I found that I could actually source the patents myself, and then do the work, do all the analysis that is needed to bring this to buyers, and then sell the portfolio and negotiate all that. So so my first full year was 2012, and it remains by far the best year ever for Tangible IP. So you can tell that I could have retired after 1 year and probably not be that different from where we are now. I'm exaggerating, but it was by far our best year, just because that was the last year where people were still buying patents left and right, and ready to pay millions of dollars for what was a very small portfolio at that time. And if I were to sell the same portfolio today, either I would not get any offer, or it would be maybe 10-20% of what I would have gotten 10 years ago. So very, very different landscape. And no, nobody could really see this coming. The AI with the PTAB, I think, was like a Frankenstein creation that maybe some people deviously plan for. We'll never know, but definitely I don't think anybody could predict that the PTAB would become kind of the patent death squad that we all heard about, and that it would become kind of politicized in a way that was kind of against the inventors, and that the USPTO would become its own you know, in a sense, enemy, where on one end you issue patents and on the other hand you essentially invalidate them, by the same administration, so to speak, which is really ironic if you think about it. So I don't think anyone predicted that. I don't think anyone predicted, Bilski and then obviously Alice and the carnage that it would cause to the patent landscape, up to this day. Still, I think if you fast forward to today, I think the IPR system is a slightly less of a concern than it was maybe 2-3 years ago. Although it's still a very big factor, but I don't think it is as acute as it used to be. And maybe it's a factor of one-on-one issues being even worse. So maybe they dwarf the IPR concern because of that. Not that the IPR environment is any better for patentees, but I think Alice has taken a bigger toll now, just because nobody knows if patents are valid anymore, which is pretty bad to start with. A pretty bad start when you're trying to transact an asset class and the very title is uncertain.
Yeah. So, you mentioned that, your first year, it seemed like it was easier, right? I'm guessing there's a lot of demand for your services and it was easy, I guess, to complete the deals. What made you, I guess, kind of stick with it afterwards? Up to this point, I guess 10 years later, keep doing that work.
Well, I'm a very stubborn person. Some around you would tell. So I guess it's probably that stubbornness that just kept me doing it, and for good or bad reasons. I decided that I was going to do that, and we found a way to do it where we could survive. And my thought was always, well, any market is cyclical by nature, so we're just going to hunker down and survive through this cycle, and then things get better again. We'll be in a really great position and with better market share and all this. So the better market share and all this turned out to be true. There are very, very few patent brokers nowadays, and we're just one of a handful left. And frankly, we get about 4 or 5 portfolios every single day that people want us to broker, and we only say yes maybe 1 or 2% of the time. So we have no problems finding patents to sell. We have problem finding buyers to buy. And so the prediction about market share turned out to be true. The prediction about the market getting better is still unfolding. Let's put it this way.
Talk about a typical deal. Obviously, you were talking about sourcing deals. So I think when you first started out, you had to look, and correct me if I'm wrong, in the beginning, you looked for the sellers, but now I guess it seems like sellers are approaching you left and right. And then I guess, can you just walk us through a typical transaction, how that happens? Like what motivates somebody to contact you from there?
Yeah, it's funny. Actually, I've been doing this for over 10 years. I've never actually reached out to someone and asked them if they were interested in selling their patents, because I always had, well, maybe I should have because others do, but we always had enough people coming to us and keeping us busy with reviewing their patents. And we knew they were willing to sell. So, convincing someone to sell, as I found out representing buyers, is very hard sometimes. As much as there's an oversupply of patent and very little demand, when you actually have demand, and which patent they want to buy, it just so happens that these guys never want to sell. So it's really hard to make the match. But turning to what you said, a typical sale, normally someone will come to us, say, okay, we'd like to monetize our patents. So we do have an intake process where obviously we have a bunch of questions to ask them about not only the patents but the reasons for the sale, past efforts that they may have made, because very often they don't tell you, but they come to you after they've tried other things. Sometimes they put people on notice, or sometimes they use another broker, or sometimes they try to sell themselves. And if they shop the patents around extensively, it's too late. They're kind of burned the assets in the market, and we're not going to be interested in taking over. But obviously, when we look at patents, the very first thing we look is, are these patents being infringed by anyone? I mean, this is what trumps everything else. If there's no evidence of use that anyone is practicing these patents, I can always predict with 100% certainty that they will not sell. It's like me trying to sell you an auto insurance policy with the best premium, the lowest premium, the best coverage, and you just don't own a car. You don't need that. And it's a problem with patents. People don't understand is that unless someone is infringing or is about to, or one of their competitors is, they're not going to be interested in purchasing this, because the only reason it would purchase this is to take care of a business risk on their end, or to monetize, or having a strategic advantage, or to monetize the assertion value. So we really focus hard on the assertion potential first, which is really a legal and technical analysis, in terms of can we create some litigation grade claim charts with these patents. And then we look at validity, of course, especially given prior art issues, 101 issues, all kind of other issues. Then we have to look a little bit at, okay, who would be the targets, and what kind of damages are we talking about? If the damages are $1 million, nobody's going to buy this if it costs them $5 million to litigate, because a lot of the buyers will be non-practicing entities, which is new. I mean, it used to be that most buyers were operating companies. Again, you go back 10 years ago, 7 years ago, people were still in kind of portfolio building mode. You had a lot of Chinese companies that were trying to go a little bit more globally and were fairly naked patent-wise, fairly vulnerable in Europe and the US, and they were looking to acquire patents. So they would be our more regular buyers, along with IV at that time. But then, with Alice and all that, it pretty much changed completely. And nowadays, most of the buyers are non-practicing entities. Not exclusively, but I would say a large percentage of our deals these days are with non-practicing entities. Not that we wouldn't love to sell or license to operating companies, but they're just not interested, and they're fine being sued. Apparently, they don't care, because a lot of the portfolios that we couldn't sell are now being asserted by the owners directly in court, and sometimes the same parties that had a chance to buy or license these patents for a song, 2-3 years ago, now have to pony up a lot more money to defend or to get a license. But it's part of their business model to do it that way.
And do you think like the people making those decisions within the operating companies are kind of starting to learn that lesson, that maybe it's
No. To be honest, no. And I come from the corporate world. Here's a little dirty secret that people should know about that explains a lot of the behavior. So if let's say that my old employer Microsoft is alleged to be infringing patent X, and I'm the owner of patent X, I'm gonna tell them, you guys infringe my patent or my patents, you should take a license. So they will review this, and they might actually be of the same opinion that this looks bad. This looks like we're infringing, and they're going to turn around and they're going to tell the business unit that owns the infringing product, if you will, hey guys, we have this claim from a third-party patent owner. We think it's legit. We think we should negotiate with them a license fee. So that there's no risk of enjoining the product is pretty low these days, but at least there's no risk of having an adverse judgment 5-10 years from now in the gazillion dollars. So the business unit will say, where's the money coming from? Well, from you, business unit, from your P&L. Then the business unit will say, well, then we're not interested. Wait to see if they're going to sue. Because the business units in most companies know really well that if they license pre-litigation, it's coming out of their P&L, so it makes them look less profitable when they roll up the numbers. Whereas if they wait until they get sued and then the litigation group takes over and then there's a settlement 2-3 years later, then it's corporate money. It's not against their P&L. It's coming out of corp. And because of that, there's absolutely no incentive in large corporations who are set up that way, and most of them are, to do any pre-litigation licensing, because the person writing the check can pass the buck to someone else who's going to write a check later on, and it's not going to impact their P&L. So if we just change that rule, I can tell you it would change overnight the face of patent licensing. I can predict that.
Is there anything, I guess, and going back to the sellers that approach you, do those sellers already know who might be infringing their patents, or is it a lot of times you're kind of, let's say a seller comes and says, and maybe you could give an example of, like, is it a company that's going through financial hardships? What is, I guess, a typical?
There's more than one typical type of interaction, but one category is what we call the crazy inventor who designed something, a better cap for a soda can, let's put it this way, and they have one provisional patent file, and they say everybody is infringing my provisional patent that I want $5 billion plus 10%. So you have those guys. Those are among the 99% that we reject, just because first, they don't have any rights, or even if they have any issued patents, we'll never be able to work with them in a way that makes them happy, because they will always feel like someone is trying to screw them. And so it's very hard to work with individual inventors, unfortunately, although, I love their inventions and their contribution, but, very often their expectations are such that, it's really, really hard to agree on something that they would find realistic given today's market. And they don't have a good view of the market. They read some headlines from time to time, and the only thing that makes the headline is, the $1 billion award. So they always think it's their case, and it's their turn to get that. So you have that. You have, as you mentioned, Eli,
not taking into account that Federal Circuit is likely to overturn that verdict as well, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's the other thing. We always hear about the initial verdict, not the overturn. At least it doesn't make the headline. So, it's like that, I'm sure you remember that lawsuit 25 years ago when someone sued McDonald's because she dropped coffee on her lap, and she was awarded millions of dollars. And after that, McDonald's had to put a warning on the cup, warning this water is hot, to disclaim liability. But nobody remembered that the decision was overturned and the damages were pretty much quashed to almost nothing. But going back to what you said, so the second, I would say, more regular user case scenario is kind of the failed startup, companies that have invested a lot in R&D and building a small niche patent portfolio, and they ran out of money because either they were not really good at executing on it, or it just didn't pick up commercially because they were too early or too late. And so we have a lot of those, and those are usually quite interesting from the sense that they were pioneers in their field, normally if it's a startup. So the patent, the group of patent they may have is usually a very good quality as far as the disclosures are. Unfortunately, very often the prosecution kind of ruin the sauce here, because you have bad claim language, too many limitations. They forgot to file continuations to keep families open, things like that. So just bad strategy, but great idea. So if there's an open continuation sometimes, and we have a great spec, we might actually take the portfolio under brokerage, and then our patent attorneys will work with the prosecuting firm, trying to steer the boat back in the right direction and get some better claims that are enforceable, and kind of clean some of the mess they created. So we have that, and then we have, I would say, the large corporation that I mentioned. We represent Siemens, Honeywell. We represent, or represented Google, HP, Orange Telecom, Carrier, other companies that we represent on the buy side that I can't name. But these large corporations obviously are very sophisticated. They know what it is to license or monetize their patents. Most of them have a very robust licensing group. They just don't know how to sell patents, and that's not well. And when they try, they usually fail. So they'd all end up turning around and coming to see us and asking us for help. And so we do this, and we've been relatively successful selling some of their portfolios as well.
Wow. I want to get to the ecosystem because I think that's a very interesting aspect of that. But I guess, imagine there's this general counsel of a startup listening to this, and he says, I want to make sure that the patent portfolio we are building is in that litigation grade shape that Louis is talking about in terms of, having strong patents. What advice? I think you touched upon some of it, obviously, cutting edge technology, having strong specification, keeping alive through continuations. But what other advice, I guess, in terms of like good prosecution practice that I guess you would advise?
Yeah, no, you're right. As you know, patent prosecution is part art, part science, and you can have a great invention and a very bad patent at the end because it wasn't done properly, which is a shame. And a lot of companies, most inventors don't have the sophistication to understand whether what they have in their hand is actually an enforceable patent or not. So we do have, and I'm not going to repeat everything that's there, but on our website we do have a little article about what makes patents valuable, and that is kind of the best practices I can share. They're all there. So if you go to tangibleip.biz, you'll find that. But at a high level, yeah, obviously we mentioned the continuation, that this is something that is very specific to the US, but obviously since it's, the most vibrant market worldwide, it's pretty important to address it. So when we see that people, just to spare some money, did not keep a family open, we always, saying, oh, too bad, we could have fixed this, but now there's no continuation. So either you have to file a re-exam, or you could always amend if there's an IPR, but you're in a pretty high risk territory, whereas if there's an open continuation, it's so easy, you just change the claim. Same thing with the lack of prior art searches. There's still a lot of prosecuting attorneys who will tell their clients, don't pay for a prior art search, the examiner will do it and it's free, right? Technically it's true, except that they know better than that. They know that the examiner will never find all the relevant prior art. They know that on average a US examiner, even if the prosecution lasts 3 years, will only spend maybe 2.5 hours on prior art searches and only look into the US database. So the patent that issues where all the prior art is cited by the examiner, I can guarantee you is 90% likely to be invalidated if it's ever challenged. There's a little bit of a, I think, cognitive dissonance between the business model of patent law firms and the reality of the market. So the first thing is prior art search. The second thing is continuation. The third thing is I would always tell people to file a PCT and try to get at least one patent in Europe and maybe one in China, depending on what technology is involved. You don't have to go in 25 countries, but at least hit a few more than just the US. It used to be that if you cornered the US market, that was more than enough. That's no longer the case. There's a domestic, market in China now and in Europe where, and sometimes there's, because of the products being sold globally, there's a lot of, strategic advantage of having a patent in Germany, for instance, or a patent in China for something that's being manufactured in China, for instance, where you can get an injunctive relief, or sold in Europe where you can get, again, an injunction in Germany. So there's some strategic advantage of doing that. But also it's just the, having enforceable claims. A lot of times people still draft claims to protect the invention and not to protect the design around, and not to think about, okay, how will my competitors think? And so they're, very narrow, and they put some limitation that they didn't have to put, and they, we just end up with patents where, yeah, technically the product is doing everything the specification describes, but that's not the way the claims were drafted, and they're just too narrow. Or you have some divided infringement issue very often that we see, or some indefiniteness. So there's still a lot of mistakes made by people who draft patents, and I just wish there were better tools to catch those. and fix those. Because when we look at these patents, we all we can do is bang our head on the wall and say, oh shoot, this is so bad. Why did they do it that way? I have my patent attorney calling me every day and said, I've just looked at so and so's patents, and why on earth did they do it this way? Or why did they say this? They didn't have to. Or why did they have this limitation in the claim? They didn't have to. But not everybody has his experience and acumen. So it's those are the things that jump to me. And unfortunately, there are more patents like this that have these flaws than none. And that explains why, although we have so many people wanting to sell, and we do have a lot of buyers wanting to buy. I represent 4 or 5 different buyers now that are actively needing patents. They just can't find one they like. They're looking for a patent that obviously is quasi perfect, and there are very few of those because most of them have flaws.
And these are patent assertion entities, or
operating companies.
Operating companies. Oh, interesting.
Yeah, all operating companies, needing some patents in specific areas for whatever reasons they have, and they just can't find them. We show them hundreds of patents, and they just can't find one they like enough, because every time they look under the hood, they find some flaws. Prior art, claim drafting issues, close families, no counterparts, some, indefiniteness or divided infringement issues, or just, no way to calculate damages the way the claim was drafted, because it's either a method claim when it should have been a product claim, or vice versa. I mean, it runs the gamut, but it's hard to find the patent everybody likes.
Right. And are these, I guess, operating companies that are facing litigation and they're looking for some defense?
Not necessarily. Okay. I mean, some might. And again, they don't always share the reasons why they're looking for something. And frankly, we don't pry. We're just happy to help them. And sometimes it helps to know the context. Sometimes they are expecting a litigation and they want to be preemptive by securing assets that read on the company on the other side. Sometimes they just want to have stuff on their competitors, or they're entering into a new area and they want to make sure they have something inorganically that quickly helps them build their portfolio, because it might take them 10, 12 years organically to get there. So there's various reasons, all good reasons to wanting to buy patents. The problem is, it's unlike real estate, where you always end up finding the right house, because if it's not perfect, you just lower the price. With patents, it's not really price related. Obviously, there is a price component, but regardless of the price, some people will not even want to acquire patents for free if they don't like the patents, because then they have to start paying for maintenance fees and prosecution fees if they're still open and all this. It's like a free puppy. It's only free for a few hours, and after that you start paying. So patents are the price elasticity for patent is really different than for most goods. It's really about the pedigree itself. There's so much uncertainty about title, and obviously 101 is a big issue. I mean, I should have mentioned that. That's the first thing that buyers say. We like the patent, but the 101 risk is too high. Or you talk to litigators and they say, we can't take this on a contingency basis for your client because the 101 risk is too high. Or funding entities will say, we won't fund something if there's a 101 risk. Come back to us after maybe you survive a 101 motion if there's one. So it's those are the big impediments.
I want to discuss the ecosystems about the patent assertion entities, which you mentioned are, these days very frequently the buyers. I mean, I think you see a dual track of both the rise or maybe revival of patent assertion entities and litigation funding. So I guess one thing that I'm interested in, there seems like a lot of division of labor, right? There's a patent owner out there, there's brokers, there's a patent assertion entity, then there's litigation funders. A lot of things are like that, but why do you think it's broken down in that way? I guess why don't the patent assertion entities do the litigation funding? Why is there such a division of labor?
Well, I mean, the ecosystem has always had the same players, more or less. Operating companies, patent assertion entities or NPEs, defensive aggregators like the RPX or AST or OIM and others. OIM being the Open Innovation Network. So I would say the mix of players hasn't changed. What has changed over the past years is who's most active. I mean, I would say the only additional player in the last decade has been, the growth and resurgence of patent funding entities who play kind of the sideline. But because they have a much bigger role now, they have obviously given a second wind to a lot of NPEs that now have the ability to fund either an acquisition or more often fund a more robust campaign. So that has brought more litigation as a result. But the operating companies used to be the main buyers, and because they have retreated and hardly buying anything, there's a vacuum. So the assets are still there for sale, and there's a vacuum of buyers. So because the funding entities now allow NPEs to have a way to fund their campaigns, they can afford to acquire more patents, knowing that they will have some funding available for good ones in their respective campaigns. So I think it's it's a combination of both. I don't think the NPs would be as active if they didn't have all this funding available, and there has been quite a lot of money coming into the IP sphere in the past 5-10 years that wasn't there before. Ivy used to play that role in terms of pumping the market. When Ivy stopped buying, there was really, I would say, a lull for a few years, and then funding entities started, being more active. But again, you know what it is in the patent market. You lose more than you win, so they have to choose their cases very selectively, and their business terms are fairly onerous because they represent a pretty high risk of not being successful, and a very expensive path to know the response to your question. Am I going to win this? So if it's going to cost you $3 to $5 million to sue a Samsung or an Apple because they're going to fight tooth and nail and not settle, and you only win one time out of three, one time out of four, even though the amount might be fairly large and there's a high risk it might be reduced later, you have to factor all that in. So because of that, most patents will not get funding, and as a result, most NPs will not buy them. Then there's another class of NPEs that will do, I would say, high volume, low cost type of campaign and assertion. So if you have patents maybe of a lower pedigree that still need to be fairly good, but may not be the ones that you want to go against, a Fortune 50 company up to the Supreme Court, there might still be some interest from some NPs to buy them, usually at no cash or very low cash up front, and then just have a revenue sharing with the seller, and then go after a bunch of smaller companies and do a slew of settlements, sub 100K settlements, and still have a fairly successful campaign. If you didn't pay a penny, anything is a profit, right? And if you share the profit, at the end of the day, nobody makes a ton of money, but at least the inventors feel somehow vindicated that someone had to pay for their invention that was infringed, broadly by the industry. So there's a bit of everything.
So just to close the loop on that, so I guess in that typical transaction, you get a seller, you vet their patents, you come up with these litigation grade claim charts. You think that they have some pretty strong assets at that point, and I guess the typical buyers are the patent assertion entities, and I guess you bring it to them. Is there, like, based on how strong the patent asset is, based on how much damages are involved, you go to a specific patent assertion entity to make that sale, or is it kind of an auction process where the multiple patent assertion entities kind of look at those assets, really high quality assets, and then they all kind of give their value about?
Yeah, again, it kind of depends. It's a little bit of both. I mean, if we know, we have a database of 75 pages of buyers' interest that we keep up to date. We talk to buyers all the time. Our BP brokerage is on phone with buyers day in, day out. So we have a very extensive confidential list of what they're looking for. So if we have something that fits that, we're going to show it to them first as a courtesy for them sharing their wish list, if you will. So we'll do that. We'll kind of give them an early preview because we know they're looking into this, and that's the reason why we wanted to have their wish list in the first place. And then depending on the type of portfolio, I mean, we're not going to show the same portfolio to an Acacia that we would show to another NP that does more volume, low end assertion. Depending on what we think the price is, or if the client is not willing to do a revenue share, or they want an all cash sale and they're not interested into anything hybrid, then it rules out a lot of smaller NPs, and then we'll just show it to a few well-funded NPs that we know are buying cash. Doesn't mean they will be interested in buying, but at least we know the other ones won't have something that the client would want to live with. So that dictates I would say the pedigree of the portfolio and the client's requirements dictate who we talk to, and also obviously depending on who's looking for what, we will reach out to these first.
So final question is, let's say there's a young lawyer out there who's listening to this. Maybe he's a patent attorney, and he goes, "No, this being a broker sounds very exciting. Making these deals happen." What advice would you give them about becoming the next Louis Carbonneau?
I would tell him, run away and never come back. Like Simba in The Lion King, right? Frankly, I always joke, if you want to become a millionaire, you start as a billionaire and you become a patent broker. So it's, to be honest, it's a very, very tough environment. And I don't say that to get rid of new competitors. I would embrace them dearly, but it's such a tough environment. And unless everybody knows you, which I think is one of our attributes, it's going to be hard for you to find someone who wants to retain you, because people want to work with the more established firms, and they're very, very few. But also, it's so hard to monetize patents. I mean, the reality is, I look at our revenues this year from last year, from 2 years ago. Not that it's going down, it's going up, but we have to reinvent ourselves each year. Most of our revenues this year will come from portfolios that have been sold in the past for no cash and are being asserted. And what we're getting now is our commission based on the deferred revenue. And we also do a ton of licensing. We are very active in licensing portfolios, voluntary licensing. We don't do any, threat or assertion-based licensing, but a lot of licensing through defensive aggregators who represent members and all this, and that's a big part of our business now. So, which wasn't there at all even a year ago. And obviously, the assertion revenues are stuff that seeds that we planted 3-4 years ago. So, if we only lived on the deals we closed, like the straight sale, we wouldn't have enough to eat probably this year. But because we've planted these seeds over the years, and we have other programs, we managed to do fairly well, and we have very, very low overhead. This is a cutthroat business where you can't afford to have overhead. So it's you basically eat what you kill, and it's not for the faint of heart. So I would tell a young attorney, if you have a real job with a law firm, keep it for now and wait until Alice is gone and IPRs are gone and the patent market comes back, and then you'll have a baker's dozen of new brokers, sprouting out, because it will be easy to do this. But currently, it's a really tough profession, and that's why there's so few of us left.
Well, that's I guess hard, maybe hard to hear from that young attorney, but it's very good practical advice. All right, thank you so much, Louis, for joining. I really appreciate you doing this.
It was my pleasure, Eli. Great talking to you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to Clause 8. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with others and leave a 5-star rating. I'd also like to thank my firm, Harity & Harity LLP, for their generous support. Clause 8 is produced by Great Feeling Studios and Brick Brewer. For more information, visit voiceofip.com. Thanks for listening.